Pregnant girl beaten on the tracks by her own mother. Lumberjack carried her home. She didn't weigh as much as I thought she would. That's the first thing I remember. Not her face, not the blood, not even the sound of it, just the way she was lighter than I expected when I got my arms under her and lifted. A woman that far along ought to feel like something. She felt like something that had already been mostly used up. The tracks ran straight through the middle of Caldwell, Kansas in those days. September 1893. The Cherokee Strip land run was 3 days out and the whole town had gone half crazy with people moving through, settlers, speculators, con men, families with everything they owned stacked on a wagon and half of it about to fall off. You couldn't walk a block without stepping around somebody's cooked pot or somebody's argument. The noise of it hadn't stopped in a week. So when I heard the screaming from down by the depot, I didn't think much of it at first. Screaming was just part of the weather that September. I was coming off a 10-day log run up in the timber country north of the Cimarron. Hadn't slept right in a week. I had $43 in my coat and a bad blister on my left heel, and I wanted a meal, a bath, and a bed in that order, and I wasn't particularly interested in anybody else's trouble. That part didn't last. My name is Cal Bridger. I was 38 years old that September. I had been a lumberjack for 19 years, which means I had been strong for 19 years and almost nothing else. I'm not saying that as a complaint. I chose it. I liked the work. Liked the particular silence of a stand of timber before you put the first saw to it. Liked the way a tree falls if you've read it right, that long, clean line through the air. Liked being out where nobody needed anything from you except your back and your hands and your judgment about how to cut. I had a room at a boarding house in Caldwell that I kept year-round even when I was up north working, because I had a dog there named Pepper that the landlady, Mrs. Groover, agreed to feed in exchange for me splitting her wood in the fall. That was the full extent of my domestic arrangements. I ate at the Hash House on Commerce Street. I had one friend, a Swede named Olaf Vestergaard, who had worked timber with me for 6 years until a widow woman in Wichita talked him into settling down. And I hadn't seen Olaf in 2 years except at Christmas when he came to town and we drank together and he told me about his children, and I told him about the timber, and we were both a little sad for reasons we didn't discuss. I was not a man who had been waiting for anything. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't brooding, wasn't looking. A man who's been alone as long as I had been doesn't usually know what he's missing because missing something requires first having had it, and I hadn't had much. My mother died when I was 11. I left my father's farm in Ohio at 19 because there was nothing on that farm that wanted me and I already knew it. I had liked a woman once in my 20s, a girl named Ruth in a logging camp town in Oregon, and she had liked me well enough but not enough to stay when a better-off man came through, and I hadn't blamed her for it, not really, not after I'd had time to think on it. A woman has to think about her future, and I had not been able to offer her much of one. So by 38 I had settled into my shape, ate alone, slept alone, worked hard, saved some, gave a little to the church at Christmas not because I was particularly religious but because it seemed like the right thing to do. I wasn't miserable. I was compact. The way a thing gets when it's been rained on for years and dried out again, and all the loose parts have fallen away. That's what I was when I came down the main street of Caldwell on a September evening, with the dust coming in off the flats, and the whole town smelling of horses and smoke and too many people, and heard the screaming from down by the tracks. I came around the corner of the depot building and stopped. There were maybe 8 or 10 people standing in a loose ring, the way people stand when they want to watch something and also want to be able to say later they weren't involved. The light was going, that flat orange prairie light that makes everything look further away than it is. I could see the tracks, and the cinders along the edge of them, and 2 figures in the cinders. One was standing, one was not. The one standing was a woman maybe 60 years old, wide through the hips, wearing a dark dress and a bonnet that had come loose. She had a piece of wood in her hand, a rail tie scrap or a board, something she'd picked up off the ground, and she was bringing it down. She was bringing it down with both hands, the way you'd split kindling. The one on the ground was trying to get her arms up, couldn't quite do it. I moved through the ring of people before I'd thought about it. The older woman raised the board again, and I took it out of her hands from behind, just grabbed it and pulled, and she spun around, and her face was something I'd rather not describe in any detail. It was past angry, past anything I had a word for, just a kind of absolute working hatred, the kind that comes from a long way back and has had a lot of time to set. She said something at me. I didn't process it. I was already looking down. The girl on the ground was maybe 18 or 19. Dark hair half come loose from its pins and tangled in the cinders. A dress that had been a good one once, a green cotton dress with white at the collar, now torn at the shoulder and filthy from the ground. She was pregnant. Far along, 7 months maybe more. I didn't know much about such things. She had one arm up across her face, and she was breathing in a way I recognized. The short, careful breath of someone who has learned in the last few minutes that breathing is something that requires management. Her lip was cut. There was blood on her chin and on the cinders near her head. I looked at the older woman. She was still talking. I gathered from what she was saying that this was her daughter, and that her daughter had shamed the family, and that she was finished with her, and that I had no right to interfere, and various other things that I am not going to repeat here. Some of the people in the ring were nodding slightly, in the way people nod when they want to seem like they're not taking sides, but they already have. I looked at the girl. She had lowered her arm from her face and was looking up at me. Her eyes were brown, and she had a cut above one of them, not deep, but bleeding the way head cuts bleed, freely and too much. I said, "Can you stand?" She tried. She got one hand under herself and pushed and made it maybe halfway, and then didn't make it any further. The way she came back down, it was clear that her ribs had taken some of it. So I bent down and I put one arm under her knees and one behind her back, the way you'd carry a child, and I stood up with her. She made a sound, not a cry, more like the air going out of something, and then went still against my chest. The older woman said something else at me. I didn't say anything back. I turned around and I walked out of the ring of people. I heard the older woman behind me still talking. I kept walking. She didn't follow. Now, here is what I need to tell you about that moment, and I'll ask you to believe me because I have thought about this for a long time, and I am telling it as true as I know how. I did not carry her home because she was young, or because she was pretty, or because I wanted anything from her. A man who lifts a beat woman off railroad tracks because he's hoping for something out of it is not a man, and I am not interested in being that kind of story. I carried her because she needed carrying, and she was in front of me, and I was able. That's the whole of it. If it had been an old man bleeding on those cinders, I would have done the same thing. If it had been a stranger's dog, I would have found the owner. That's what I tell myself, and I believe it's mostly true. The part that might not be completely true is this. When I lifted her and she went still against my chest, there was a moment, maybe 1 second, maybe less, where something in me that had been very quiet for a very long time made a sound like a door opening onto a room that had been sealed up. Not romantic, not anything like that, something older and simpler than that. The feeling of being needed, not asked for, not contracted with. Just needed, the way a shored-up beam is needed when the weight comes down. I noticed it and I didn't do anything with it. I just kept walking. I carried her to the boarding house on Plum Street. Mrs. Groover opened the door and looked at what I was carrying, and to her eternal credit she said nothing, only opened the door wider and pointed me to the back bedroom on the ground floor that she kept for when her sister visited. I laid the girl down on the bed. She was conscious, though not entirely present. She was somewhere between awake and not, the way people get when the body has taken enough and decided to do its accounting in private. Mrs. Groover looked at the blood on her face and said she'd get water and clean cloths and whiskey, in that order, and she'd also send her boy for the doctor. I said the doctor first. Mrs. Groover looked at me for a moment and then went and got her boy, who was 14, and told him to run. I pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat in it. The girl's eyes were open now, tracking the ceiling. Her hands were resting on the round of her belly, both of them, that way women do when they're protecting something, not even thinking about it, just doing it. I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Agnes." I said, "All right, Agnes, the doctor's coming." She didn't say anything to that. I said, "That woman on the tracks, was that your mother?" A long pause. Then, yes. I didn't ask anything else. There wasn't anything else to ask that the night hadn't already answered. The doctor was a man named Pratt, and he'd been in Caldwell long enough to have seen most varieties of trouble. He came in, looked at Agnes, and looked at me with the particular question doctors have when they walk into an unclear situation. I told him briefly what had happened on the tracks. He nodded once and put his bag on the table and went to work. He was in the room with her for a long time. I sat in Mrs. Groover's kitchen, and she made me coffee that I didn't ask for, and she set it in front of me without saying anything, and I appreciated that about her. Pepper the dog came out from somewhere and lay across my feet, which he usually only did in cold weather. I sat there with my hands around the coffee cup, and I listened to the sounds from the back room, and I told myself it was none of my business, and I believed that almost completely. Dr. Pratt came out after a while, and he said the ribs were bruised, 2 of them maybe cracked. He couldn't tell for certain without an X-ray machine, which Caldwell did not have. He said the cuts on her face were superficial. He said the baby, and here he paused and looked at me carefully, the baby appeared to be all right. He'd listened, and the heartbeat was there, strong. He said she needed rest and quiet and no further injury, and he looked at me in a way that made clear what he wanted from me in that sentence. I said, "She's safe here." He considered me for a moment. He must have decided something, because he nodded and put on his coat and went out. I sat a while longer with the coffee. Then I went to the door of the back bedroom and knocked softly and opened it a little. Agnes was lying with her eyes open, cleaned up now, a white cloth strip wrapped around her midsection. The lamp was turned low. I said, "Doctor says you'll be all right." She said, "I know." There was something in how she said it, flat and certain and old, the way very young people sound when they have had to grow a particular kind of knowledge ahead of schedule. Like she'd known she'd be all right because she'd been not all right enough times before to understand the difference. I said, "You need anything tonight, Mrs. Groover is here. I'm down the hall." She looked at me then. Really looked, the way someone looks when they're trying to figure out what they owe you, whether you're a debt or a threat. What kind of man does this, and why, and what does he want for it? I said, "You don't owe me anything." She looked at me for a moment longer, then she looked back at the ceiling. I closed the door. I should tell you about the land run, because you can't understand that September without it. The Cherokee Strip was 6 million acres of grassland in northern Indian Territory, and the government had bought it from the Cherokee Nation that summer and was opening it to settlement. September 16th, 1893, noon, the guns would go off, and 50,000 people would race across the starting line to claim a 160-acre homestead. The biggest land rush in American history. The whole frontier was ending, and this was one of the last pieces of it, and everybody knew it, and the knowing made people strange, desperate in a particular way, like they were grabbing for something they could feel slipping. Caldwell was a staging town. All September it had been filling up with runners. That's what they called the people who were going to race, runners. They came in wagons and on horseback and on bicycles and on foot. They brought their families, their dogs, their plows, their hope. They camped in the streets and in the fields outside town. They argued about claim markers and water rights, and which sections had already been taken by Sooners, the people who'd sneaked across early to stake a claim and wait for the gun, which was illegal and also, apparently, very common. I was not a runner. I had no particular interest in farming. I was in Caldwell because I kept a room there and because it was on the way back from the timber country and because Pepper was there. But that week, surrounded by all of it, I had watched the runners and thought about what they were doing and felt something complicated about it. Something like hunger without an object. All these people coming west with their whole lives packed onto a wagon, betting everything on a piece of ground they'd never seen, for the chance at what? A home. A place with their name on it, something to leave someone. I had none of that. I had a room on a yearly lease and a dog and a blister on my heel and $43. Not miserable, just none of that. Agnes stayed 4 days. The first day she slept nearly the whole of it, and Mrs. Groover brought her broth and biscuits and sat with her in the afternoons. I worked around the house. There was always something at Mrs. Groover's that needed doing, a gutter to nail back, a door hinge to reset, and I did not particularly seek Agnes out, and she did not particularly seek me out. The second day she was sitting up when I knocked in the morning to ask if she needed anything, and she said she was fine, and then she said, "The baby moved." I said, "That's good." She said, "Yes," and then she said, "She does that, moves when things go quiet." I said, "You know it's a girl." She said, "I know." I didn't ask how she knew. Some women just know that. I don't have a scientific explanation for it, and I don't need one. I was at the door, and I should have left, and I almost did. Instead, I said, "What are you going to do?" She looked at her hands for a moment. She said, "I don't know yet. I said, all right. She said, I don't have anywhere to go. She said it clean, without self-pity, the way you'd state a weather fact. It's raining and the road is muddy, and I don't have anywhere to go. I thought about that. I stood in her doorway and I thought about it the way I'd think about a problem with a tree. Where's the weight? Which way will it fall? Where do you need to be standing? I said, my landlady takes in boarders and she has an open room. I can ask her what it costs. She looked at me. I said, that's all, just asking. She said, all right. I talked to Mrs. Groover. The rate was $4 a month including breakfast and supper. I told Agnes. She said she had $11 in a purse that her mother had not managed to get to, which she'd had sewn inside her dress. I told her that was almost 3 months. She said she'd need to find work before then, and I didn't argue with that because she was right. Third day I came back from the hardware store. I'd been pricing out saw handles, and I found Agnes in the kitchen. She was at the stove, which surprised me, and she was making something that smelled like onions and salt pork. Mrs. Groover was sitting at the kitchen table watching her. Mrs. Groover had the expression of a woman who has just been told she should sit down and is not entirely sure how she feels about that. Agnes said without turning around, Mrs. Groover said I could. I looked at Mrs. Groover. Mrs. Groover said she insisted truly. I told her she shouldn't be on her feet. Agnes said, still to the stove, I'm pregnant, not broken. That was the first time I heard her say anything with an edge to it. It wasn't unpleasant. It had the sound of something real behind it. We ate together that evening, the three of us at the kitchen table. Agnes had made a soup with what was available, and it was good, better than anything Mrs. Groover or I could have produced. Afterward I told her so, and she said, it's just salt pork. But she was looking at her bowl, and there was something in her face that I thought might have been the first easy thing she'd felt in a while. On the 4th day, I want to tell you what happened, but first I have to tell you something I've been leaving out. I had been asking around town about Agnes's mother. Her name was Vera Colclough, I'd found out. She had come down from Nebraska with her daughter on the land rush, one of the thousands who came through Caldwell that week. Agnes's father was dead, had been for 5 years. Agnes had gotten herself in her situation, her mother's words, as reported by the woman at the milliner's who'd been standing near the tracks and heard more of it than she'd wanted, with a young man who was now apparently gone and not coming back, destination unknown. Vera had decided, at some point on the journey south, that she was not going to run the strip with a pregnant, unwed daughter on her hands, and that this was Agnes's problem and Agnes could deal with it, and that if Agnes showed up at whatever homestead Vera eventually claimed, she would not be welcome. She had made this known on the tracks of the Caldwell Depot while swinging a board. I had found this out and I had sat with it for 2 days, and I had not told Agnes because there was no point in telling her something she already knew. She knew she was on her own. She had known it since before I found her on those cinders. What I had not decided in those 2 days was what to do with what I felt about it. What I felt about it was something I did not entirely have a name for. It was not the abstract anger you feel at injustice in the world. It was more specific, more personal. It was the feeling of something being wrong in a way that implicated me, not because I had caused it, but because I was here and I was capable, and the wrongness was right in front of me and continuing. A tree that's about to come down in the wrong direction, you can see it. You know which way it needs to go, you have a saw. On the 4th day, she was up earlier than me, which I didn't expect. I found her sitting on Mrs. Groover's back step in the morning cold, her arms folded across the top of her belly, looking east. The strip ran east. The gun was going off in 2 days. I came and stood near her, not close, just near. She said, without looking at me, my mother will be on that line. I didn't say anything. She said, she'll get a claim, she's good at wanting things. She said it without bitterness, just knew it. I said, you'll be all right here. She looked up at me then, the morning light on her face, that clear October-coming prairie light. The cut above her eye had scabbed over and her lip was healing, and she looked, I want to find the right word for this, not fragile, the opposite of fragile. She looked like something that had been hit hard and had taken the hit and was still here, still looking at the morning, still thinking about what came next. She said, why are you doing this? I said, doing what? She said, any of it. I thought about that. I thought about the honest answer. I said, I don't have a good reason. She said, that might be the most honest thing a man has said to me in a year. I said, I'm not usually a man who has much to say. She looked at me for a while longer, not the assessing look from the first night, not weighing what she owed, something else, something quieter. She said, you have a dog. I said, Pepper, he's around somewhere. She said, I like dogs. I said, he likes women, mostly indifferent to men, myself included. That made her almost smile, not quite, just the beginning of it. I said, Mrs. Groover says if you're agreeable she'd like you to help with the kitchen in exchange for half the room rate. She's getting along, and the Land Rush crowd has been hard on her nerves. Agnes was quiet for a moment. Then she said, $2 a month instead of $4. I said, that's what she said. Agnes said, all right. That was the practical part of the conversation. That part was finished. We sat in silence for a while, which was not uncomfortable. I am a man who has spent 19 years in the company of timber, and I know that silence is not the absence of something, it's the presence of something else. She said eventually, what do you do after the run? I said, go back up north when the timber work starts again, February. She said, and before February? I said, stay here, fix things, Mrs. Groover always has a list. She said, you've been here a while. I said, 6 years. She said, do you like it? I thought about that. I said, I like that it's mine, the room. The arrangement. It's not much, but it's mine, and I know what it is. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I don't have anything that's mine. I didn't say anything to that. She said, I had my dress, the green one, I left it. I said, it was torn up pretty bad. She said, I know, but it was mine. I thought about that. About the particular grief of a small thing that was yours being gone. Not the large things, those you know how to grieve. The small things are harder sometimes. We sat there until the sun came up enough that the chill started to go out of the air. Then she pushed herself up from the step carefully with the weight of the baby shifting, and she said, I should help Mrs. Groover with breakfast. She went inside. I sat on the step for a while longer, alone. Pepper came and sat beside me and leaned his head against my arm, and I put my hand on his back, and we watched the morning come in. The land run went off on September 16th, noon. I walked down to the starting line that morning because you'd have had to be made of something harder than I am to not go see it. 50,000 people lined up along the Kansas border, as far as you could see in either direction. Horses, wagons, men on bicycles, men on foot, women and children. The whole population of human hope jammed up against a line in the dirt. The starting gun was a sound that went through your chest before your ears caught it. And then they went. I have seen a lot in my life. Timber falling, floods, a mine collapse in Colorado when I was 24 and working a side job that I don't talk about. I have seen things that were large and things that were terrible, and I have seen things that were beautiful. That charge across the strip was all three of those things at once. Dust going up until you couldn't see the ground. A sound like nothing I could compare to anything, not thunder, not a rush of water, a sound that was just human need at volume. I watched it for a while, then I walked back. Agnes was at the window when I came in. She was watching the dust cloud from the kitchen window, her hand resting on the glass. She didn't say anything when I came in. I didn't say anything either. I hung up my coat and went to the table, and Mrs. Groover poured me coffee, and the three of us were quiet in the kitchen while the world rearranged itself outside. After a while, Agnes said, she's in there somewhere. I said, probably. Agnes said, I hope she gets what she came for, and I believe she meant it. That was one of the first things I understood about Agnes, that she was capable of meaning it. Not the performed forgiveness of a woman who wants to be seen as good. The real thing, which is much harder and much quieter. She hoped her mother got what she'd come for. Not because it would change anything between them, or because she wanted a reconciliation, but because wanting something that hard and not getting it is a particular kind of terrible, and she didn't wish that on anyone, even her mother. That took a kind of bigness that I didn't have myself, and I knew it. Her daughter was born on November 3rd, 1893. I know the date because I was in the house. I had not gone north yet. The first snow had been late, and the timing wasn't right for the logging crews, and I'd had a letter from the foreman saying to wait. So I was there in Mrs. Groover's kitchen, drinking coffee I didn't need and pretending to read a week-old newspaper. while things happened down the hall that were entirely not my business. Dr. Pratt was there. Mrs. Groover was in and out. I sat in the kitchen and I listened to the house. I am not going to describe what I heard. It is not mine to describe. What I'll say is that at some point in the late morning the sounds changed, and then there was a different sound, short and thin and sudden. And Mrs. Groover came into the kitchen with her hands still damp and her eyes bright, and she said, "She's here. They're both fine." I said, "Good." Mrs. Groover looked at me. She said, "Go see them, Calvin." I said, "That's not, she doesn't need me in there." Mrs. Groover said, with the authority of a woman who has been watching me for 6 years and knows exactly who I am, "She'd like you too." I went down the hall. I knocked. Dr. Pratt opened the door and looked at me and stood aside. Agnes was in the bed. She was worn down in a way that was different from the tracks, not beaten but emptied, the particular emptiness that comes from a large effort completed. She had the child in her arms, wrapped in the white flannel that Mrs. Groover had gotten ready. The baby was making a sound that wasn't exactly crying and wasn't exactly not, a small continuous sound like something that has just arrived and is not sure yet about the arrangement. Agnes looked up. Her hair was damp against her face, and her eyes were ringed, and she looked like she'd walked through fire and come out the other side still herself. She said, "Come see her." I came to the side of the bed. The baby was very small and very red, and her eyes were shut tight, and she had a remarkable amount of dark hair for someone who had been in the world for approximately 40 minutes. Agnes said, "Her name is Clara." I said, "That's a good name." Agnes looked down at her daughter. She said, "I don't know what I'm going to do." I said, "You'll figure it out." She said, "That's not very comforting." I said, "No, but it's true." She looked up at me again. She said, "I was going to ask you something." I waited. She said, "I don't know how to ask it right." I said, "Try." She said, "Mrs. Groover says you're here through the winter. She says you're a good man. She says you've been—" She stopped, looked back at Clara for a moment, then back at me. "I don't want charity. That's not what I'm asking." I said, "All right." She said, "I can cook and clean and keep a house. I'm good at it. I can earn my keep. But I need someone who isn't going to—" She stopped again. And then she said, flat and direct, looking me in the eye, "I need someone who isn't going to hurt us." The kitchen is at the back of the house. It was quiet except for the stove ticking and Pepper somewhere in the hall. The light through the window was November light, thin and long. I said, "I won't." She said, "I know." And the way she said it, I understood she had known it for a while, that this was not a test of me but a statement about what she'd already decided. She was telling me she knew, and she was asking me to confirm it because she was owed the confirmation. She said, I'm not asking you to. I don't mean anything more than what I said." I said, "I know what you're asking." She said, "All right." Clara made a small sound. Agnes looked down at her. I said, "I'll be here." I don't know how to tell the next part without making it sound different from what it was, so I'll try to be precise. The winter of 1893 into 1894 was cold. Not record cold, but the kind of sustained cold that gets into a house and stays. I hauled wood every morning, enough to keep all 3 stoves going. Mrs. Groover had a list of repairs that backed up over the fall, and I worked through it methodically. New weather stripping on the back door, a cracked joist in the front parlor floor, the kitchen pump that had been losing prime since August. I fixed things. That is what I do when I have time and a structure around me that needs maintaining. Agnes took over the kitchen entirely by December, and Mrs. Groover, who had been cooking for herself and the occasional boarder for 15 years, was visibly relieved. Agnes cooked the way she did everything, direct, without waste, better than was strictly necessary. She baked bread twice a week, and the smell of it in the mornings was the kind of thing that made the cold feel like it belonged there, like it was the correct framing for warmth. Clara grew. She had her mother's dark hair and her own eyes, which were not quite any color for the first few months before they settled into a particular shade of gray-green that I later decided I liked better than most colors I'd seen. She was a specific baby. I mean, she seemed even very young to have opinions. She cried when she meant to cry and stopped when she was done. She slept where you put her as long as you put her right. She regarded me for the first 2 months with the solemn attention of a judge, and then at some point in January decided I was acceptable, and after that let me hold her without objection. I am aware this is not the kind of thing a man my age and my particular position is supposed to report. I am telling you anyway. Agnes and I had an arrangement that was not named. We lived in the same house and ate at the same table and talked about practical things, what needed doing, what needed buying, what Clara needed. We did not talk about her mother. We did not talk about the man who had left. We did not talk about what would happen when spring came and I had a decision to make about the timber country. We did talk, though, more than I had talked to anyone in years. She asked me things about the timber, about Ohio, which I didn't have much good to say about but described anyway, about Olaf, who she seemed to find funny, the idea of a man that big being managed by a woman in Wichita. She told me about growing up in Nebraska, about her father, who had been a gentle man and had died of a fever when she was 13, about what that had done to her mother, whom she did not hate. I want to be clear about that. She did not hate her mother. She understood what grief could do to a person. She had watched it do it. She told me she had been learning to read before and then hadn't had the chance to keep at it. Mrs. Groover had books, and I had two on timber management and one novel, which I'd bought at a train station in Denver and never finished. She read it. She read it in the evenings after Clara was down, sitting near the stove with the lamp close. She read the way she did most things, completely, without half measures, the book held in both hands and her whole attention on it. I watched her do that, and I thought about Ruth in Oregon, who I had not thought about in years, and I thought about the difference between being alone and being lonely, which I had previously thought were the same thing and now was not sure about. In February, I got a letter from the timber foreman saying the crew was assembling in 10 days. I held the letter for a while, then I put it in my coat pocket. I did not say anything to Agnes that day. I told myself I was waiting for the right moment, which was not entirely a lie. I helped with the wood in the morning and ate breakfast, and repaired the front gate latch that had been loose since December and fed Pepper his dinner in the evening. Normal day, normal things. After supper, Agnes put Clara down and came back to the kitchen, and I was still at the table, and she looked at me and said, "Something's wrong." I said, "Not wrong." She said, "What then?" I got the letter out and set it on the table. She read it, she set it back down. She didn't say anything for a moment. I said I could write back and tell him I'm not coming. She looked up. I said, "The money's not, I have enough for the year. I could stay and find work here. There's plenty of work in a town this size." She said, "You like the timber." I said, "I do." She said, "Then you should go." I said, "Agnes." She said, "I'm not asking you to stay." I said, "I know." She said, "Clara and I will be fine, Mrs. Groover." I said, "Agnes." And then I stopped because I had things in my throat, and I was not practiced at getting them out, and the ones that were there were large, and I was not sure they'd come out right. She waited. She was good at that, at waiting without pressing. I said, "I don't want to go." She was quiet. I said, "I haven't not wanted to go north in 19 years. Every year I've been ready for it, ready to get back to it. This year I'm not ready." She was looking at me. The lamp was between us on the table, and her face was half in the light and half in the shadow of it. I said, "I don't know what I'm asking. I don't know what I have to offer. I'm a lumberjack. I'm 38 years old, and I have a room and a dog and enough saved to not go broke for a year, and that's the whole inventory." I stopped. She said, "That's not the whole inventory." I said, "What's missing?" She said, "You carried me off the tracks." I said, that was just." She said, "I know what it was. I was there." She paused. "And then you put me in a bed and got the doctor and didn't ask me for anything. And then you fixed everything in this house that was broken for 6 years. And then you held my daughter." I said, "That doesn't add up to much." She said, "To me it does." I did not say anything for a moment. She said, "I'm not going to ask you to stay. That's not how this works. You go if you want to go, but I want you to know." She stopped, started again. "I want you to know that if you stayed and if you wanted to, if we wanted to try to build something, I think we could." I said, "You think?" She said, "I think." And then she said, "I don't do anything by halves. If I'm in, I'm in." I thought about the letter. I thought about the timber, the cold smell of it, the first saw on the first tree. I thought about what the timber had been for me for 19 years, which was a place to be where the rest of it didn't apply, where you were just a body doing a job, and that was enough. I thought about whether I still needed it to be that. I looked at Agnes. I said, I'll write him and tell him I'm staying. She said, you're sure? I said, I am. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached across the table, not far, the table wasn't wide, and put her hand over mine. Her hand was warm from the stove, warm and rough from work, and she held it there flat and still and not squeezing, just there. Present, an anchor. She said, all right, Cal. And that was that. We were married in April 1894 at the Methodist Church on Merchant Street. Mrs. Groover was the witness. Olaf came down from Wichita with his wife and stood with me and cried, which I had never seen him do in 6 years in the timber, and which I will let him have without further comment. Clara, by then 5.5 months old, attended in the arms of Mrs. Groover's daughter and apparently made friends with everyone in the first pew during the ceremony, which sounds about right. It was a small wedding. We didn't have the money for anything large, and neither of us wanted it. Agnes wore a white blouse she'd made herself and a gray wool skirt that Mrs. Groover had altered for her, and she had done something with her hair that I can't describe except to say she looked herself. That's what she looked like. Just herself, without any performance of what she was supposed to look like. And that was something I had never seen in a woman at a wedding before and didn't know I had been missing. When the minister asked me the usual question and I said I did, I meant it in the simplest and most literal way I knew how to mean something. Not a declaration, not a performance, a statement of fact. We stayed in Caldwell 3 more years, and then we moved. I had been thinking about the Strip, about those 6 million acres that had been claimed and were being worked, and about the fact that the land runs were over and done with. The frontier was closing. Everyone said so, and they were right. The time to get ground was passing. I had saved enough, with the work in Caldwell and the part-time logging I'd done in the Osage Hills in the winters, to make a start. Not much of one, but a start. Agnes said yes before I'd finished laying it out. She said, tell me what you need from me. I said, nothing you're not already doing. She said, then let's go. We took 40 acres in the northern strip, near a creek that had good water and a stand of cottonwoods on the south edge. 40 acres is not much. We knew that. We were not under any illusions about what we had taken on. The first winter we lived in a sod house that I built in 3 weeks with help from our nearest neighbor, a Norwegian named Bjornstad who had claimed the section east of ours and who became, over the following years, a good friend. The sod house was cold and dark, and it smelled of the earth, and Agnes made it habitable through a combination of hard work and sheer will and the insistence on small dignities. Proper curtains on the window cut into the sod, a real tablecloth, the lamp kept full and trimmed. She said a house was what you decided to make it, and she had decided. Clara walked at 11 months, which Bjornstad's wife said was early. She talked at 14 months, clearly and with evident purpose, which was not a surprise to me. She had her mother's particular quality of going directly at things. I have been trying to tell this story in order, and I have done a poor job of it, because order is not how memory works, not for me. What I have is not a sequence. It is a collection of fixed images, like photographs, and I move between them. Here are some of them. Agnes at the stove at 5 in the morning in November, her breath visible in the cold, starting the fire. The deliberate way she laid the kindling, like every piece of wood was the right piece. Clara at 2 years, sitting in the dirt near the creek, filling a tin cup with water and emptying it. Filling it and emptying it, the concentration on her face. The spring of 1896, a late frost that came in March and took our winter wheat. Agnes stood at the edge of the field and looked at it for a long time. She didn't cry. She said, what do we plant instead? I told her. She said, then let's start. The evening Bjornstad came over with his wife and 4 children, and we sat outside in the summer dark, and somebody had a fiddle and Agnes danced with me, which she had not done before. And she was a better dancer than I was by a considerable margin, and she was not unkind about it, which I appreciated. The morning I came in from the barn with my hand bleeding from a saw slip, a stupid mistake, the kind you make when you're tired, and Agnes took my hand and held it under the pump and wrapped it without asking me anything about how or why, just wrapped it with her jaw set in that particular way she had when she was managing something. When she was done, she held my hand for a moment, both of hers around it, looking at the bandage, checking the ends were tucked right. Just held it. That one I go back to sometimes. There is one more thing I need to tell you about, and I have been going around it. In the autumn of 1896, 3 years after the tracks, Agnes received a letter. She read it at the kitchen table. I was outside. When I came in, she was still sitting there with it in her hands, and her face had the expression of someone who is in the middle of a decision they thought was already made and are finding it is not. I sat across from her. I waited. She said, "It's from my mother." I did not say anything. She said she has a claim, north section near Enid. She's been there since the run. She looked at the letter. Her neighbor wrote it. My mother can't. She's not well. I said, "What kind of not well?" Agnes said, "Her heart, it sounds like." I said, "What does she want?" Agnes said she wants to see Clara. A pause. She says she's sorry. A long silence. I said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at me. She said, "I don't know." I said, "It's your call." She said, "You don't have an opinion." I thought about it honestly, which is what she was asking me to do. I said, "I think what she did to you was wrong. I think it was bad, Agnes, what she did. And I don't forget it." I said, "And I also think a woman who's sick and old and has a granddaughter she's never seen is still a person. And I think you'll know for the rest of your life whether you went or whether you didn't." Agnes looked at the table. She said, "She's still my mother." I said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not going for her. I'm going because of who I want to be." I said, "I know." She said, "Will you come?" I said, "If you want me there." She said, "I want you there." We drove the wagon to the Kalkluff claim in October when the weather was still good. The claim was modest, a frame house, not sod, which told me she'd had some money or had moved fast on her land. There was a kitchen garden, mostly put to bed for winter, and a small barn and 2 horses. Vera Kalkluff came out onto the step when we pulled in. I had not seen her since the tracks. She was 3 years older and smaller than I remembered, which I don't think was actually true. I think she had just seemed larger in the violence of that night, the way things in motion seem larger than they are. She looked like a woman who had spent 3 years working hard ground and who had been ill and who was carrying something she was not going to put down. She looked at Agnes, then at Clara, whom I was holding, then at me. I looked back at her. She said to Agnes, "You came." Agnes said, "I came." Vera said, "I didn't think you would." Agnes said, "I wasn't sure I would." There was a long silence. Then Vera said, "She looks like you did, the hair." Agnes said, "Her name is Clara." Vera looked at Clara. Clara looked at Vera with her full gray-green attention, the way she looked at everything new. She did not make an opinion known. Vera said, "I'm sorry." And it was plain from how it came out, without preparation, without flourish, that she had been holding it for 3 years and had not had a good way to say it and still didn't, and was saying it anyway. Agnes said, "I know." She did not say it's all right because it was not all right, and Agnes did not lie. She said, "I know," which is a different thing. "I know that you are sorry and I am here and that is where we are." I stood with Clara on my hip and watched the 2 of them and thought about what it costs a person to come back to a thing they would rather leave closed, and what it means that Agnes was standing on that step instead of back in Caldwell or on the 40 acres. What it cost her, and what it said about who she was. I had thought about what I had to offer her the night I almost didn't write the letter, and I had said room and a dog and a year's savings. And she had told me that was not the whole inventory. Standing there on that October afternoon, I understood what she had meant a little better. The inventory she was counting included this, the person I had watched her be. The way she came back to hard things. The way she meant her forgiveness and did not dress it up. The way she had said, "I'm not going for her. I'm going because of who I want to be." You do not find that. I mean, you do not go looking for it and come home with it. It comes from something being broken in the right place at the right time, or from a set of circumstances you'd never have chosen, and you being there when it happens, and being willing to be the person who stays. Clara is 8 years old now. She reads better than I do, and she knows it, and she has been kind enough not to make an issue of it. We have 120 acres. We bought the Bjornstad parcel when Magnus moved his family to Missouri, which I was sorry about, though I understood it, and we have 40 more from a claim that came open to the south. I still do some logging in winter. There is timber in the hills to the north, and I have contracts with 2 mills, but the farm is the main of it now. Agnes is, I don't know how to finish that sentence in a way that is adequate to the person. She is the main of it. The main of the farm and the main of the household and the main of what keeps me oriented toward the right direction when I would otherwise just be a large man cutting things down. I do not say this to diminish myself. I know what I am and what I'm worth, and she has helped me know it more clearly than I did before. That is one of the things she did. She saw what I was worth, and she named it back to me in the plain way she named everything, without flourish, just, "This is true. You are this." Nobody had done that before. Not because they were bad people, most of them. Just because they were busy with their own accounting, and I wasn't their concern. She made me her concern. And I made her mine. This is the last image I'll give you. Last November cold evening, snow coming in off the plains. Clara had gone to bed. I had come in from the barn and was at the washstand taking the day off my hands, and Agnes came in from somewhere, the pantry maybe. She was always the last one moving at night, and she walked past me and put one hand between my shoulder blades, flat and warm through the flannel, for just a moment the way you touch something to confirm it's there. Not a declaration, just a hand on a back. Then she went past me and banked the kitchen stove for the night, and I heard the iron door close. The lamp was low. The snow coming against the window made a sound like someone passing outside, soft and regular. I stood there at the washstand with my hands wet and that warmth still between my shoulders where her hand had been, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing I did not know I was missing. Not the love story version of it. Not the version where a man sweeps in and saves someone and is rewarded for his heroism with devotion. The real version. Where a man does a plain thing, a physical thing, lifts a girl off railroad cinders because she needs lifting, and then stays present and useful and constant, and where a woman with her own strength and her own pain decides that this is the man, this one, and gives him the extraordinary gift of being certain about him. Being certain about him. I am 61 years old. I have been certain about very few things. Most of what I knew for sure has turned out to be mostly right, but not completely. The timber I was certain about, and the timber was good to me. Olaf I was certain about, and Olaf was the friend I thought he was. And Agnes. I was certain about Agnes standing at the washstand that November evening, the snow coming in, the stove banked low, and she on the other side of the room with her back to me, doing the last thing of the day, and I knew. The way you know a sound in the timber, the particular quality of this, what it is, that it's real. I dried my hands. She turned from the stove and her eyes found mine across the kitchen in the low light, and she held them there a moment, and in that moment she wasn't asking me anything or telling me anything. She was just looking at me. Looking at me the way you look at something that belongs to where it is. I walked across the kitchen, and I put my arms around her from behind, and I held her. She put her hands over mine. The snow came against the window. That was all. And